Ordinarily on this show, of course, we talk about real geopolitics, about international relations and things that really matter and what's going on and trying to give you interpretation and context, etc. Today, though, you would think if you didn't know our channel already, that maybe you're talking about the recent skit of some situation comedy or of some new Netflix show or something that's ludicrous and obviously not real. Because when we're going to be showing you some of the things we are talking about, it is really hard to understand that this is actually real life and not some skit, which is pretty scary when you're talking about some of these actors actually have access to nuclear weapons and the launch codes. And to try and make a sense of a lot of this stuff that's coming out of the White House, things that are coming out of Kiev, and things that are coming out of the UN General Assembly here in New York City, we have John Mearsheimer back, international relations theorist, professor of political science at the University of Chicago, and big-time friend of the show. Professor, welcome back as always.
I'm glad to be here as always, Danny.
Well, and so this is kind of an unusual one. So I mean, we'll just start right off the top that all the things that are happening. It was already going to be a lot happening because the UN General Assembly was going to happen today or started yesterday, and there was a meeting at the UN Security Council. Lots of things going on with the Russia-Ukraine war, stuff going on in the Middle East. So it was already going to be kind of an action. And then Trump just kind of did something that Trump does like to do a lot and throws a monkey wrench into all this by yesterday afternoon. By the way, right before we went on with one of our shows, and says something that just seems completely out of left field, even for Trump, by saying that basically that the Ukraine side can just, win it all and go all the way back to the 1991 borders, back to the original form. As it turns out, Russia is only a paper tiger. They've been fighting aimlessly for 3.5 years, and you really don't have to worry about them. So they're just kind of like not anything to be taken seriously. I mean, what is your initial reaction to this tweet here, or truth?
Well, the first reaction is, what planet is President Trump living on? I mean, this is kind of hard to believe that he would make a statement like this, because everybody who follows this war, and he started off by the tweet by saying he now finally understands what's going on. You would expect that means he understands that Ukraine is losing and is pretty much in a hopeless situation. So why would he say this? And I would note to you that he not only talked about taking territory back that has been conquered by Russia since 2014. You remember they took Crimea in 2014. And of course, they've taken those 4 oblasts since then. But he talked about not only restoring that territory, but going beyond that, possibly. In other words, taking Russian territory. And you just sort of scratch your head and say, this is the president of the United States. Is he really saying this? So that's one reaction. The second reaction when you read the tweet is that this is just bloviating. It doesn't really add up to anything. First of all, he doesn't provide any explanation whatsoever as to how you're going to reverse the situation on the battlefield, and Ukraine is going to be able to capture all that territory that it's lost and then some more. There's just no explanation for how this happens. And then furthermore, if you read carefully, he is not talking about the United States doing anything to make this happen. He's passing the buck to the Europeans and Ukraine. It's very clear. There's no mention of sanctions in there. We're not talking about sanctions anymore. And furthermore, he makes it clear when he starts talking about how the rollback is going to work, that it's going to be the responsibility of the European Union and the Ukrainians, not us. And he says at the end of the tweet that we're going to give NATO weapons. We're not going to quit on that front. We'll give the weapons to NATO, and NATO can do what they want with the weapons, right? So it's not the United States that's in the driver's seat here. It's the Europeans. So not only does he not explain how we can reverse the situation, he makes it clear that he is not changing America's position on Ukraine one iota. So all this is some wild and crazy statements about how Ukraine can win the war.
And so I'm gonna go on to Zelensky's reaction to it because it might be different than some might have thought. It wasn't unmitigated excitement because I think he read between the lines and what wasn't there. But let's just kind of stick with this point for a moment because this is a huge departure from where Trump started, which is he's going to get this solved in 24 hours, 100 days, or yeah, 100 days and then 50 days, 10 days, and whatever now about a month or something like that. Obviously, none of the deadlines ever meant anything. Nothing was ever done as a result of them. But he went from being the peace president and we're going to solve this war to now he's just like going, yeah, y'all can go and win it. So what do you think of this transition, even rhetorically?
Well, Trump understands full well that he can't impose peace on the Ukrainians and the Europeans on one side and the Russians on the other. He surely understands that the demands of the two sides here are incompatible in every possible way. So there's nothing the United States can do. And we can't reverse the tide on the battlefield. So what do? And I think basically what Trump is doing, and he's been doing this for a couple weeks now, is he's pulling back and he's telling the Europeans and the Ukrainians the ball is in their court and they have to settle this one with the Russians, however they choose to do so. Remember, he says that he's going to give Ukraine the weapons via NATO. And what NATO does with those weapons is up to NATO. He's not going to tell them what to do. So Trump is, in effect, washing his hands of this conflict, and he is protecting himself for when Ukraine loses on the battlefield. He does not want to be in a position where people can say Donald Trump withheld aid for Ukraine, and that's why they lost. He's optimistic. He thinks they can win. He's going to give them the wherewithal through NATO to see if NATO or the European Union and Ukraine together can pull Ukraine's chestnuts out of the fire. But don't say that Donald Trump didn't do his best to help this situation. That's kind of what's going on here.
So this is really probably the most logical and rational interpretation is that, and I know you and I had talked about this months ago about what Trump may end up doing. Would he just walk away? Would he say, I did everything I could and you guys didn't pick it up and you didn't take anything anywhere, so now you're on your own, instead of walking away, which then would open him up to, an avalanche of criticism. Now it seems like he's saying, you know what's a better idea is I'll pretend that I'm actually going to continue supporting them. And apparently there's like $1 billion per month for 10 months from our stuff that's going to be sold to NATO, et cetera. So I guess he'll say, we'll keep this little trickle of stuff alive to give lip service to the fact that we're doing something. But then he actually is laying the foundation to walk away, just not in those words.
Yeah. I mean, think about the sanctions, Danny. There's no mention of sanctions in the tweet. And Trump is not talking publicly about imposing sanctions on the Russians. And without sanctions, I mean, where is this going? And he understands that sanctions is an important argument here. And he understands that he's going to get blamed for not putting sanctions on the Russians. So how did he deal with that? He said to the Europeans, you have to put sanctions. And of course, we're talking about secondary sanctions here, which means sanctions on India and China. He said, I'm willing to put sanctions on India and China, but I'm not going to do it alone. The United States alone is not going to pay the price. This is America first. You Europeans have to go along with us. And as soon as you put secondary sanctions on the Russians, which again is sanctions on India and China, I'll put secondary sanctions on. But of course, he knew full well, and he's been proved correct, that the Europeans are not going to put secondary sanctions on China and India. So he doesn't have to put it on. And he can say later, I was willing to do it. It's just that the Europeans who make all this noise wouldn't do it themselves. And I was not going to make the people in my country pay the price. So he's protected himself there, as well as on the dimension of fueling or sending weapons to Ukraine. He's continuing to send weapons to Ukraine. And by the way, he's making the Europeans pay for those weapons, which is something that satisfies his base. So I think if you put aside these wild and crazy comments about how Ukraine can win and what a paper tiger Russia is and so forth and so on, I think Trump is basically following the game plan that you and I divined a while back.
Well, and a lot of people got really excited about this, and in fact, I'm going to show you here in a bit some clips of some very strong sounding American response to this, and how Trump is being powerful and threatening Russia, etc. But I tell you, one person who I think does interpret correctly is Volodymyr Zelensky.
With time, patience, and the financial support of Europe, and in particular NATO, the original borders from where this war started is very much an option. Are you surprised to hear that?
A little bit. A little bit. I mean, I'm sure in my people, in my army, and I'm sure in strengthening of in support of the United States. But President Trump was more positive in it. And he showed that he wants to support Ukraine to the very end. So we understand now that we are ready to finish this war as quick as possible. And he wants, and I want, and our people want. But he understands that Putin doesn't want, and he understands that he is not winning, but he says to everybody that he will win. And I see very... It was a little bit surprise for me. You're right. I was very positive signals from the side that Trump and America will be with us to the end of the war.
Yeah. See, I mean, he didn't even say anything about winning. He just said, you'll be with us till the end of the war. And, in that whole long comment there, he's literally stumbling over his words, which he doesn't often do. He usually is pretty straightforward about what he wants to say. And he never said anything about, yes, we can win, this is going to help us. He just said, well, it signals that he's going to be with us to the end, which is hearkening back to Biden's, as long as it takes, et cetera. So how do you interpret his response there?
Well, I mean, he has to be diplomatic here. He can't say that Donald Trump is blowing smoke and he's not putting, his money where his mouth is. He can't make that argument. But he's a sophisticated guy. I mean, he's been waging this war for a couple of years now, and he surely read very carefully what President Trump had to say. And you don't need a triple-digit IQ to figure out that Trump is not providing the wherewithal to help Ukraine reconquer all that lost territory. It's not even.
And by the way, for those who may not have heard, this came after the meeting between Zelensky and Trump. And according to reports I got, one of which was from Kiev itself, that meeting was about 6 minutes long, i.e. it wasn't a meeting at all. It was more like just some comments, and then they left. So it didn't sound like there was a lot of discussion going on.
Well, what is there to discuss here? I mean, Trump is not going to impose sanctions on Russia. He's not going to get in the fight. He's passing the buck to the Europeans, and he's saying, the European Union and Ukraine have to rescue the situation here. Not us. We'll help by giving weapons, but that's it. Zelensky understands that. Listen, when the United States was operating in Ukraine under Joe Biden, we had the pedal to the metal. We were doing a great deal to help Ukraine win the war. And Ukraine could not win the war with all that European support and all that American support. Well, once the Americans under Trump begin to backtrack and shift the burden onto the Europeans, who have huge economic problems of their own, how can anyone possibly make the argument that Europe plus Ukraine can do what Europe plus the United States plus Ukraine could not do? And the answer is they can't. What are they going to do? Launch another offensive like the one they launched on June 4th of 2023? I don't think so. I mean, That's not going to work. The Ukrainians have no military option here. We could get into this. They're in deep trouble on the battlefield. And everywhere you read about this, it's not just you and I making this argument. All sorts of Ukrainians are making the argument that they're in the deep kimchi. So how are we going to pull this, one off? How's Trump going to pull this one off? How is he going to help Ukraine recapture all that lost territory and maybe even take some Russian territory? And the answer is he is not.
He's not. So if that was last night on Fox between Bret Baier and Zelensky after the meeting with Trump, and then today at the UN General Assembly, Zelensky went back out there again. Now he's going to paint a picture here that in these gravest of geopolitical overtones, that this is an existential war being waged for our way of life, versus what the Russians are doing. And I suppose you can call this a call to arms. First of all, watch this and then give me your interpretation of this, especially coming after the previous sound clip.
Do you have protection against similar threats? The facts are simple. Stopping this war now, and with it, the global arms race, is cheaper than building underground kindergartens or massive bunkers for critical infrastructure later. Stopping Putin now is cheaper than trying to protect every port and every ship from terrorists with sea drones. Stopping Russia now is cheaper than wondering who will be the first to create a simple drone carrying a nuclear warhead. So we must use everything we have together to force the aggressor to stop.
So when he says stop Russia, I mean, with I guess kind of what you said a second ago, with what army, so to speak, with what resources? There's not going to be one, and that was made clear last night. Is this just, well, I have to say something, so I'm saying this, or how do you interpret that?
Well, the real problem, Danny, is that the Russians have no designs on Eastern Europe, and they have no designs on Western Europe. Furthermore, they do not have an army that is capable of conquering territory in Eastern Europe, much less running to the beaches of Dunkirk. This is threat inflation of the worst sort, and we hear it all the time. But the Russians have never shown any interest in conquering territory beyond Ukraine. And furthermore, as you and I have talked about ad nauseum, and people on our side have talked about ad nauseum, the Russians don't have any designs on conquering Western Ukraine. And in fact, they would be crazy to try to conquer Western Ukraine because it's filled with ethnic Ukrainians who would put up huge resistance over the long term against a Russian occupation. So the idea that we're sort of dealing with Adolf Hitler, in May 1940, and he's poised to take France and Belgium and Holland, and then when he's done there, he's going to head east. I mean, this is just not the world that we live in. Russia is nowhere near as powerful as the Soviet Union was. Russia is not a potential hegemon in Europe. And the Russians know full well what happened when they tried to conquer Afghanistan. They know full well what happened when they occupied Eastern Europe during the Cold War. They were up to their eyeballs in alligators dealing with trouble in East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Albania, Romania, Yugoslavia, right? They're not going back into Eastern Europe. This conflict is all about NATO expansion into Ukraine. And once Ukraine is defeated and becomes a neutral state, if the West is smart, it can go a long way towards improving relations with Russia over the long term. But of course, the West won't be smart. They'll continue to poke the bear in the eye, and the bear will continue to poke the West in the eye and Romania in the eye, and we'll have trouble for as far as the eye can see.
Yeah, you talk about poke the bear in the eye, not being, I guess, thinking about reality. Why should that change now? Well, at the United Nations Security Council meeting last night, Secretary of State Marco Rubio gave a warning to his Russian counterparts.
This war has to end, and we have done everything we possibly can, and will continue to do everything we possibly can to bring it to an end. Very generous offers have been made. For example, a ceasefire at the current lines of contact, while all the other details on the future of the conflict could be worked out in terms of future territorial lines. The president has shown extraordinary patience in terms of not assessing additional sanctions in the hopes of having a breakthrough in this regard. And all has come to what appears to be not just a stagnant one, but an era, and we've entered a period of what appears to be potential even escalation, with the historically highest number of strikes we've seen over the last few nights and before. And now we are also watching incursions into neighboring airspace by both drones and airplanes. The president is a very patient man. He's very committed to peace, but his patience is not infinite. And as he has said repeatedly, he has before him the opportunity and the options of imposing additional economic costs on the Russian Federation, if necessary, in order to bring this to an end.
If necessary, to bring it to an end. And I mean, what do you make? Well, let's back up to the first part of that a little bit about his extraordinarily generous offer to allow Russia to stop fighting on the current line of contact.
He does not understand, and this is true of the vast majority of people in the foreign policy establishment in this country, that for Russia, this is an existential threat. The possibility of Ukraine becoming a member of NATO is simply unacceptable to the Russians. It is an existential threat, and they are not going to stop until Ukraine and the West are defeated, and they both accept the fact that Ukraine has to be a neutral state, number one, and it has to be disarmed to the point where it's not an offensive threat to Russia. And until you get to that point, or until you accept that point in the West, all this talk about generous terms makes no sense at all. So Rubio is, he's like a ship passing in the night with the Russians. They just, these are two sets of people who are just operating on very different planets. The Russians have demands that Rubio is simply unwilling to meet. And given that, the war is going to be settled on the battlefield, period. End of story.
Yeah, in fact, that point was made by Dmitry Peskov, because he said, he was asked, what does Russia think about these claims about 1991 borders and maybe into Russia and all that? He didn't sound like he was particularly frustrated, but then zeroed back around to the root causes.
President Trump's statements were made after communicating with Zelensky and, apparently, under the influence of the vision that Zelensky had laid out. This vision is completely contrary to our understanding of the current situation, but at the same time, we will also have the opportunity to bring our position to the American side. As for these specific statements, there is an obvious situation in the Russian economy which more than eloquently says that despite all the illegal sanctions, our economy absolutely retains its stability and predictability. The war is not aimless. The war is to ensure our security and our interests and eliminate the root cause of the conflict that exists between Russia and Ukraine, and which, in fact, exists in the field of European security in general.
Well, if there's anything on the Russian side, they are monotonous and relentless on saying the same thing year after year about what's important. So one wonders, will the message ever actually get through?
I think the answer is no. I mean, I like your rhetoric year after year. It's not month after month or week after week. It's year after year. In fact, Danny, before the war started, the Russians made it clear what their demands were. And since the war started in February of 2022, they have repeated their position ad nauseum. And it was most clearly laid out last June 14th. This is June 14th, 2024. And what Putin said then was hardly different from what he said before June 14th. And it's hardly different from what's been said since. And his lieutenants say the same thing over and over. But the West simply refuses to acknowledge what Russia's position is. And as long as that is the case, And people in Ukraine and people in the West continue to demand that the Russians accept certain provisions of an agreement that the Russians categorically reject. You're not going to get an agreement. And as we've said ad nauseum, this one's going to be settled on the battlefield.
Yeah, I mean, again, we just don't see any evidence that anything is going to compel the Russians to give up their deeply held, emotionally held red lines about how this thing has to end because of the root causes, because of all the causes, et cetera. Or at least you would think that's the case, because it doesn't seem to be getting through. When you talk about lieutenants, just look at the U.S. side here for a minute, because now you can tell me here. There's a couple of sound bites I want to show you here from some of our side, and this may be intended for a domestic audience, because I worry if it's not for a domestic audience, if it's because we actually think this, then we have a bigger problem than I may think. Here, first of all, is Caroline Levitt talking about how frustrated President Trump has been.
He's been incredibly frustrated with President Putin and Russia, who continue to talk nice, but then we wake up every morning and in the West Wing, we're receiving reports about how Russia bombed Ukraine and they continue to kill innocent civilians. And the president is making it very clear that Russia is in a very weak position. And he's absolutely right. They are a massive country with a massive military. They are a war economy. But it's been 3.5 years. And look at how Ukraine has been able to defend itself. And so the president has said that we are going to continue selling weapons to NATO, and NATO and Ukraine can choose how to use those weapons. But the way that this weapon arrangement has now taken place under President Trump is putting America first, because we are selling these weapons to Ukraine and to NATO, and NATO is backfilling those weapons to Ukraine. So the American taxpayer is benefiting from this. That's a change and a shift in position from the Biden administration. But the president has said if Vladimir Putin wants to keep fighting, well, the president knows how to fight.
The president knows how to fight? I mean, let's start there. What the hell does that mean?
Well, very importantly, Danny, she said, and I'm sure it's true, that Trump is greatly frustrated that he has not been able to get a peace agreement, because he said that he would do that even before he got in the White House and shortly after, if he didn't get it beforehand. So I'm sure he's frustrated. And maybe he thought after the meeting in Alaska that it would be possible to get some sort of deal. So I can understand that. But you want to listen to what she said that Trump was going to do. And she basically repeated what is in the Truth Social post that we talked about at the outset of the show. She said that the Europeans and the Ukrainians are in charge. She basically said that President Trump is passing the buck to them. And furthermore, she emphasized that the Europeans are going to pay for the weaponry. We're not paying for the weaponry. This is America first. And that's completely consistent with what I said at the start of the show. And it's just more evidence that Trump is washing his hands of the Ukraine war. And at the same time, he's going to great lengths to protect himself when Ukraine loses.
And what do you make of the repeating there about, hey, Russia? She didn't use the term paper tiger there, but she implied it by saying, hey, Russia's been fighting for 3.5 years, and something that see, I think it was General Petraeus said a couple of days ago, or a few weeks rather, that no, it was Kellogg. That's right. Keith Kellogg said that Russia actually is losing because if it was winning, it would have already taken Kiev by now. So the fact that they've only taken in the last 2 years or so 1% more additional territory, that's somehow evidence that they're losing. I don't know. But if they're losing and we're going to give this weaponry for some period of time, but Russia doesn't lose, how do they worry about that? Or how do they square that one?
Don't ask me. I have no idea. I'll tell you one thing, though, for those people who think Russia's a paper tiger, and there appear to be a number of people who are thinking in those terms these days, I think that what we ought to do is fly them over to Kyiv, put them in a uniform, put them on a truck, and then send them up to the front lines. Now, according to the Wall Street Journal this past weekend, it's not clear they'll get to the front lines because that paper tiger is now tearing apart the lines of communication. And it's very hard for the Ukrainians to get troops from the rear up to the forward edge of the battle area. But let's assume that they get up there. Let them spend a couple weeks fighting against the Russians. And if they're still alive after a couple weeks, they can tell us whether or not they think the Russians are a paper tiger or not. And my guess is that those who survive that scenario will tell us very clearly that the Russians are not a paper tiger, and that the Ukrainians are at a great disadvantage and have their hands full dealing with this massively armed steamroller that's coming at them.
Now, I may be asking you to speculate on something that you can't get inside the head of the Russians anyway to figure out, or even in the White House for that matter. But as best you can interpret from the signals that you get from multiple sources, it almost looks to me like Trump, with this boisterous True Social post, and then the consequent actions that he is going to continue selling, apparently at the rate of $1 billion per month, at least for 10 months is the number I've seen bandied about so far. It sounds like he's just saying, this thing's not going to go on, so at least I'm going to benefit from it. So we're not going to do anything to bring it to an end. We're definitely not going to pressure the Ukraine side, which is the one area he does have some leverage, I think. But instead, it's like, we'll just sit back and make some money in between now and then, and probably just, make some more True Socials over the months and just kind of keep it going. Do you see it any differently?
No, I would just add that he's got to protect himself so that he doesn't get blamed when Ukraine loses. And he is doing that, as I explained before. And in the process, he's making money. I mean, this is a disastrous situation for the Ukrainians, as you and I have been arguing for a long time. And as you and I argued a year ago at the Council on Foreign Relations, as you and I were a tag team, of course, saying that it was ridiculous to continue this war because Ukraine is just going to lose more territory and more Ukrainians will die. We've been making this argument until we're blue in the face, but nobody listens and they continue to fight. And again, President Trump telling the Ukrainians that they can capture all that territory that they lost, if anything, just encourages the Ukrainians and the Europeans to pursue this foolish policy of continuing to fight the Russians and not stopping the war, which would be in Ukraine's best interest. So as you watch this war evolve and you watch both Ukrainian and Western behavior, it more or less makes you sick to your stomach when you think of what's happening to Ukraine.
Now, let me ask you a separate question here. Let's look at it from the perspective of Ukraine for a moment. So Zelensky, I think, correctly interpreted based on his Fox News interview, which we showed you part of a minute ago. But from the position of the Ukrainian armed forces, so those guys are sitting out there in the front. You just mentioned that Wall Street Journal piece talked about how difficult life is at the front just to get to the front, much less to survive and continue to take some actions. And as a matter of fact, over the past about 36 hours or so, according to reports I got just before we came on the air, Ukraine has apparently a fairly successful counterattack going on north of Pokrovsk right now, which in a local area might be able to actually cut off a piece of the Russian advance here. That's on top of a lot of other areas where Russia continues to make its own advances. So in larger terms, it's a small thing, but it'll give them a momentary, I guess, feel-good thing, especially if they're able to pinch that thing off. But the bigger issue for the troops themselves, they see what the life is like there, and then they heard no new weapons, nothing in any size anyway, no new sanctions. So it's like basically you guys are on your own with the Ukraine or with the Europeans, but that hasn't turned into much in terms of actual combat capacity. What is that going to do to your will to continue fighting when you don't see anything new on the horizon?
Well, I think it can't help but erode their will. The question is how much and how fast. I'm actually surprised, as I've said before, that the Ukrainians have continued to fight as ferociously as they have up to this point. There's no question that they have a huge problem recruiting people to go to the front lines. The number of draft dodgers is enormous. And furthermore, they have a significant desertion problem.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, the forces that they do have on the front line, who General Searsky himself says are outnumbered 3-1 overall and 6-1. Just think about that, outnumbered 6-1 at certain critical points along the front line. Hey, nevertheless, the Ukrainians continue to fight like wild dogs. In a certain sense, it's truly impressive. It shows you the power of nationalism. And they've gone on longer than I thought would be the case. But at some point, I do believe that the front lines will break, because you can't sustain this forever. I'd also note, Danny, when they talk about these Ukrainian counterattacks, and they talk about the Ukrainians moving all sorts of forces from other areas to the Pokrovsk region, and then launching counterattacks. Counterattacks are offensive operations. You're out in the open. And as all the news stories on what the battlefield looks like tell us, when you're out in the open, you're exposed and you're likely to die. So I would imagine these counterattacks are resulting in significant Ukrainian casualties. And furthermore, what's happening here is that, they may move forces to the Pokrovsk area, and they may slow things down there in terms of the Russian advances. But the problem is they weaken themselves on along other positions on the battlefield. And the Russians have a huge enough force advantage that they then take advantage of the Ukrainians in locations where they have shifted forces away from that particular area to the Pokrovsk area.
Well, in fact, as a matter of fact, that is exactly the dynamic taking place right now, because a little over a month ago, when Ukraine moved some of the reinforcements from one part of the battlefield, the Liman area, over to help the Pokrovsk area, which is where now those troops are doing this counterattack. Now then, with that combat power withdrawn, now Russia did immediately start taking advantage of that, and they have made some significant and more rapid advances in the Liman area, which is, of course, very important in the Donetsk area. So that is playing out exactly as you suggested.
Yeah, I mean, again, General Searsky says that the Ukrainians are outnumbered 3-1, and some people are arguing that the overall number is even bigger than that. That the number 700,000, which is given for the number of Russian forces up inside of Ukraine, the number is actually higher than 700,000. But anyway, Searsky says the Russians have a 3-1 advantage overall, and at critical points, they have a 6-1 advantage. You just want to think about that. That's a huge advantage. And then we talked about the Wall Street Journal that talked about how Russian drones are making it almost impossible for Ukraine to move troops up to the front line. And then you start talking about just the overall balance in the drone war. It's quite clear it shifted significantly in favor of the Russians over the Ukrainians. Early in the war, the Ukrainians had the advantage in terms of drones. Now the Russians have a clear advantage. If you look at artillery and other pieces of weaponry, the Russians have a significant advantage. Very important. If you look at glide bombs, right? Yeah. The Russians have a huge inventory of glide bombs, which they use liberally against fixed positions on the Ukrainian side of the line. And the Ukrainians admit, if you read the newspapers carefully, that these glide bombs are devastating. How many glide bombs do the Ukrainians have? 0. Then when you go to air defenses, we read about all these air attacks involving missiles, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, drones, deep into Ukraine. It's quite clear that the Ukrainians don't have the capability to shoot these missiles and drones down, and that the Russians are pounding the industrial base inside of Ukraine. Ukraine has been making an effort to develop weapons of its own, to develop its own industrial base so that it can fight the war better. Fully understandable. But the Russians have good intelligence. They know where those industrial locations are, or those industries are. And when they're ready to open up and start producing weapons, the Russians attack. And therefore, the Ukrainians don't have much of an industrial base. The West doesn't have much of an industrial base. So the Ukrainians they're badly outnumbered at every turn. And then we were talking before about, desertions and the fact that they can't recruit people in large numbers to replace those who are killed. They're doomed.
I want to take a look at something else here that was also in the news the last several days. And that is, we're going to go first of all to Lindsey Graham, because he was suggesting he was grinning ear to ear, first of all, because he's been wanting all these big sanctions, which is odd to me because he didn't get his sanctions at all. And yet he's still eager. And so instead of talking about something that he did get, now he's thinking, hey, maybe we can shoot down some Russian jets.
What should you do if a Russian jet flies into your country? Shoot it down. He's tried to go out of his way to get Putin to the table. We don't want to humiliate Russia. We just want to end the war. And to our friends in Russia, here's what Trump did today. He told NATO, I'll sell you all the weapons you want. You can provide them to Ukraine. And as to Ukraine, you can use them any way you want. So to the Russian military, you're going to be up against the high-end American weapons that will be sold to NATO for the benefit of Ukraine. And this war is coming to your backyard here with no limitations like Biden.
So first of all, there's a lot of limitations compared to Biden, because the last Biden package was $61 billion. This is, for if all 10 months were put together, $10 billion. So it's a whole lot less on its own merit there. But what do you say to his comment there that basically, okay, now Russia, it's going to suck to be you because you're going to go with this high-tech American weaponry when it hasn't done anything over the last 3.5 years?
I mean, he's blowing smoke, right? I mean, first of all, I think there's sort of been 4 big incidents here that people are talking about. One is the drones that went into Poland. 2 is one drone that wandered into Romania and then out. And then there's all this talk about these drones that were near the airports in Oslo and Copenhagen, and Oslo Airport and Copenhagen Airport were shut down as a result. So there's sort of 3 incidents involving drones. And then there's the incident of 3 MiGs that are said to have flown into Estonian airspace. Now, the Russians categorically deny that they flew those MiGs into Estonian airspace. So the Russians have no interest in sending MiGs into NATO territory. And I think the worst case that could be made for the Russian position is that those 3 MiGs went over this small pile of rocks that's about 25 kilometers from the Estonian coastline in the Baltic. The Russians deny that they went over these rocks, which belong to Estonia. But let's assume that they did. It's just not that big a deal. And with regard to the drones, the one drone that went into Romania, is this serious? No. And then the drones in Oslo and Copenhagen, there's no evidence that they're Russian drones. So the only real incident here are, I think, about 19 drones went into Poland. And the Russians did not do this on purpose, according to them. And the Russians have proposed that the West and Russia get together to investigate exactly what happened. That's what the Russians want to do. They want to investigate what happened. They're not denying that those Russian drones wandered into Poland, but they have made it clear that they did not do it on purpose, right? They were not trying to provoke Poland or NATO. And they said, let's examine what happened here. And by the way, these were reconnaissance drones or dummies. They were not, armed drones. But NATO, of course, refused, or the West refused, to try and figure out exactly what happened here. I would also note to you that it appears that of the 19 drones that went into Poland, NATO shot down 3 of them. These are drones, reasonably easy to shoot down. They only shot down 3 of the 19. So not a very good performance. But my bottom line here is I do not believe the Russians are trying to pick a fight with NATO. And if you have an incident, I think it makes the most sense for NATO to make sure it doesn't escalate so that we don't end up in a shooting war with the Russians. That would not be in our interest. It would not be in the Russians' interest. It would not be in anybody's interest. So as long as the Russians are not attacking countries in NATO, we should go to great lengths to make sure that we keep a cap on the volcano. But what's happening here, Danny, as you surely realize, is that NATO forces are taking advantage of every one of these incidents and blowing them out of proportion to make it look like the Russians are up to no good. And what NATO has to do is react furiously and seriously so that the Russians understand we mean business. And this is all designed to solidify NATO and to get the Americans firmly committed to the Ukraine war. These are effectively false flag operations. That's what's going on here. What we're trying to do in countries like Estonia, Latvia, Poland for sure, Ukraine, is figure out a way to drag the Americans in. So if a drone wanders over Romania, and these sorts of things happen in warfare, you and I know that very well. If that happens, the smart thing to do is to deal with it and keep the cap on the volcano. But again, we're
okay. Well, wait a minute. Let's look at that proposition to draw the United States in. Okay, from Ukraine's position, that's cut and dried clear. That obviously he would like that to have someone physically fighting alongside of him. But let's look at the European contingent. What value would they have to draw the U.S. into an actual conflict that all of us together almost certainly could not win? And even in the best of case, it would be an incredibly expensive Pyrrhic victory. So why would we even want to touch that, as opposed to just saying, Art, this is stupid. Ukraine can't win this. Let's just get it off the boards here, because there's some benefit to that, and there's some potential catastrophic cost to doing it the other way. What is the thought process there?
Very hard to say. I mean, they're not clear. Maybe they think that they can draw the United States in without actual conflict. They can get Trump to play hardball at a rhetorical level. They can get Trump to deploy additional American forces to Eastern Europe, to places like Poland, maybe even the Baltic states. That they can get Trump to up the support that he's giving to Ukraine. And maybe they think that if we have a limited conflict, we don't have to worry about going up an escalation ladder or up the escalation ladder. Maybe they think you can cap the volcano. I mean, you and I understand that we're playing with fire here, right? We want to go to great lengths. I mean, the Biden administration, to its credit, understood this. We do not want to let this one spin out of control. But what's happening here, Danny, is I think the East European elites especially, but the European elites in general, are beginning to sense that the end is near and that Ukraine is going to lose, and they're desperate. And that's why you have all these false flag operations popping up now. And this raises the question, you and I have talked about this before, assuming that we're right and NATO loses, that Ukraine loses, which means NATO loses, and the Russians have a clear victory. It's an ugly victory, but it's a clear victory. Question you have to ask yourself is, what is the West going to do then? We have so much invested in this war, Danny. I mean, that's what's really remarkable. And every day that goes by, we invest more in the war. And that means that when things finally go south in an obvious way, the pressure on the West to do something is going to be enormous. And who knows what we'll do.
Well, that is a concern that we always have of any kind of potential escalation, and we'll just keep on tracking on this and seeing where it goes. Before I let you get off, though, I don't want to get you away without taking a look at something in the other part of the world. It's a lot of conflict going on, and that is in the Middle East. And this article here in the Times of Israel says Trump promised Muslim leaders he won't allow West Bank annexation. He tells Times of Israel. But apparently Trump is telling lots of other people that he can do that. And then this other part, this subheader here, is that the UN, the Iranian president says we will never bow before aggressors as snapback sanctions loom. So you have the twin issues of actually multiple issues. You have the issue in the West, in Gaza Strip, which is continuing on, and Israel is moving further into there, causing even more and more casualties, more suffering to the human population. There's talk about openly annexing the West Bank. And then apparently there's, in the near term, there's going to be some potential problems with Iran again. So where do things stand in the Middle East in terms of having any kind of peace or stability?
Well, the issue of annexing the West Bank is not, in my opinion, a very important issue relative to Gaza and relative to Iran. I mean, the fact is, if the Israelis go out and annex the West Bank, what is Trump going to do? The answer is nothing. So he can say that he's not going to allow Israel to annex the West Bank, but that assumes he has coercive leverage over the Israelis, and he doesn't. They can do pretty much what they want. And if they want to annex the West Bank, they'll do that. I might add, by the way, that I think the principal reason the Israelis are reluctant to annex the West Bank is because of what the Saudi reaction will be and how that will foreclose an Abraham Accord with Saudi Arabia, and what the UAE response will be, because there's a chance the UAE will take the existing Abraham Accord and throw it in the trash can. But again, I don't think that's the key issue. The key issue is stopping the genocide. Trump is complicit in the genocide. He's as guilty as his predecessor, and he's done nothing to slow it down. And if anything, he's continued to fuel the genocide. And I see no evidence that that policy is going to change. With regard to Iran, I would imagine that the reason that the 3 European countries put the snapback sanctions on, they go back on September 28th, 4 days from now. It was on August 28th that the E3, those 3 European countries, called for snapback sanction. And there was a 1-month grace period. So they go back on September 28th. The Iranians have said very clearly that the end result of this is we're not cooperating with the IAEA. That means nobody will know what the Iranians are doing with their nuclear program. We really don't even know how much of their nuclear program survived the 12-day war. And it could be the case that a lot survived, or even if a lot didn't survive, they have the capability to rebuild the program quickly. Who knows? But you're not going to know without IAEA inspectors in there. And with the snapback sanctions coming, IAEA inspectors are not going to be in there. And that's going to allow the Israelis and their cutouts in the United States to argue that Iran is racing down the nuclear path. And you know what that means in terms of the likelihood of an Israeli/American attack on Iran. So things are set up for more trouble on the Iranian front. There's no end in sight to the genocide in Gaza. The Israelis are pounding away in southern Lebanon. They're pounding away in southern Syria. They're doing horrible things on the West Bank. And I think there's even a possibility of a shooting war with Egypt, because it's very clear that the Israelis would like to expel the Palestinians into Egypt. And the Egyptians, anticipating this, have reinforced and strengthened their forces in the Sinai, which has made the Israelis very unhappy, because the Israelis would like to push the Palestinians into the Sinai. So I wouldn't be surprised. I'm not saying it's likely, but I wouldn't be surprised if you had a war between Egypt and Israel. But things are as bad as ever in the Middle East. I think that's the bottom line.
And what do you make of this? Let me show one more headline here. Is that especially if you're talking about something with Iran, you have this problem that all the strikes that were done in the so-called 12-day war, satellite imagery show that Iran is sort of rebuilding key missile sites hit by Israel, and that experts say a main component of the large mixtures needed to produce solid fuel for weapons is still missing. Iran believes resuming missile production is the key to deterring Israel. So you could almost argue from the Israeli perspective that the longer they wait, that the more difficult it's going to be in the future. And of course, we don't have any idea how long or how much the Russians may have been helping with air defenses, especially. There's some rumors that they have, but I haven't seen anything tangible. But what are the pros and cons from the Israeli perspective of, dealing back with Iran again? And even a bigger question than that, no matter what if the Israelis choose to do something, can they, quote, take out the Iranian regime with their existing military capacities using the United States as a proxy?
Well, there are a lot of questions here. I think when you read that headline, it makes it seem like the Israelis today have a window of opportunity. In other words, before Iran rebuilds those ballistic missile sites, they can go in and wreck them, and in effect, take away Iran's capability to hit Israel. But you want to remember that when the war ended, the 12-day war, the Iranians were pounding Israel with ballistic missiles. And the Iranians made it clear, and nobody contested them, that they had a lot more missiles left to pound Israel with, that they could go on continuing to pound Israel for weeks, and that they had actually withheld some of their, or a lot of their, best ballistic missiles. Now, if that's true, and I see no reason to think it's not true, that means that regardless of this rebuilding that's in the slide that you just put up, the fact is the Iranians still have a heck of a lot of ballistic missiles with a heck of a lot of firepower. And if Israel picks a fight with them now, Israel is going to get pounded. So I'm not sure there is a window of opportunity here. And the other thing you want to remember is that the Iranians have other cards to play. And one is shutting down the Straits of Tehran and making it impossible for oil to come out of the Persian Gulf, which would have a huge effect on the world economy. So the Iranians have cards to play, and the Israelis and the Americans surely realize that. But I still wouldn't be surprised at all if the Israelis attack Iran sometime in the fall, and that we jump into the fight as well.
God help us if that happens. It just I don't see militarily. You tell me if you have a different opinion. I don't see military the combined capacity from the United States and Israel, plus whatever we're doing with the Ukrainians, that we have the military ability to, quote, destroy Iran. All we can do is blow a bunch of stuff up and keep a state of conflict going, which would then invite a counter response back onto Israel again. And their Iron Dome and all the other David Sling, et cetera, their integrated air defense showed that they can only stop some of that stuff incoming. So they would get pounded again. I see no value in even attempting to do so. I mean, what am I missing?
I agree with you. I mean, I think that if you look at their nuclear program, this is the Iranian nuclear program, and you listen to what Ted Postal said on your show, it's quite clear that the Iranians have the ability to secretly build nuclear weapons. They can build nuclear weapons in places we don't see. And in some places that we do see, they can put them deep enough underground that we can't get to them. You know, even with these huge bunker buster bombs that we have. So I think there's no way the United States can use military force in conjunction with the Israelis to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons if Iran wants to get nuclear weapons. Now, the Iranian president and Ayatollah Khamenei have both said in the past 2 days that Iran does not want nuclear weapons, that they're not going down the nuclear road. I don't know whether you can believe them or not. If I were playing Iran's hand, I would pursue nuclear weapons and at the same time say, I don't want nuclear weapons. That would be the smart thing to do. But I'm not sure that the Iranians don't mean it and that they're not pursuing nuclear weapons. But again, the thing is, Danny, if you don't have IAEA inspectors in there, which will be the case if snapback sanctions go on in 4 days, then you can't see what the Iranians are doing. And if you can't see what the Iranians are doing, you and I know very well that the Israelis and the Americans and the Europeans will assume worst case. And they'll spin out all sorts of stories about how Iran is on the threshold of acquiring a bomb, and that's why we have to go in and attack Iran right now. But then again, as you pointed out, that does not solve the problem, right? You have to go in there on the ground if you're going to destroy the nuclear program. You have to go in and find it. And we're not going to invade Iran.
Well, I certainly hope so. Don't give him any ideas, Professor. I don't want people to think, hey, there's an idea. Let's hope that doesn't happen. But as all these things, especially when this snapback sanctions go into effect here in a few days, we'll see what, if anything, but impact that has on situations, or if Ukraine or Iran ever gives in to the pressure and decides it's in their interest to allow the IAEA inspectors back in. We'll continue to monitor all that. But we are very grateful, as we always are, for having you come on and providing such illumination on this, both of these issues today. Reminding everybody that you don't have to wait every couple of weeks for John to be on our show. You can go to his Substack there, and he got all kinds of great stuff that you can keep up to date with him on this. Some of that's even ours I see in there. So you can see that is there as well. So anything you want to highlight from your Substack here?
I don't, Danny, but I can assure you I'll put this show up as soon as I can.
Well, we certainly appreciate that as well. Thank you very much for coming on today, and we'll look forward to seeing you and everybody else on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.